It's dark out there. Hi. My name is Mridula Koshy. I'm a writer. I have a couple of books to my credit, but we're not here today to talk about them or me. I'm the moderator. If things go well, I think you won't hear very much from me. We'll see if we can convince these two to talk at and away with one another, with each other. And our topic, as was mentioned, is borders and crossing. I'm sure that a big part of the thinking, especially after I read the brief description of the topic, that a big part of the intention here is to talk about geopolitical borders, particularly because we're looking at two people from countries other than India, but very much in relationship to India. So we have Ashok, who's from Sri Lanka, and Farah Ghuznavi from Bangladesh. But it would also be a shame to confine ourselves to that. I'm not sure how often a Sri Lankan writer or a Bangladeshi writer sits down to write and thinks, today I'll be writing as a Bangladeshi writer or a Sri Lankan writer, and particularly as that relates to Indian writing or India. Perhaps some of the former and less of the latter. So let me start by doing introductions. Ashok is a writer and illustrator. Two of his books, Kolpati People. I don't have a copy of Kolpati People, but his recent novel, Serendipity, is available. Perhaps some of his other books also in the bookstore outside. Kolpati People and The Good Little Ceylonese Girl were shortlisted for the Gratian Prize, Sri Lanka's premier literary award. Kolpati People is currently the biggest selling book of adult English fiction ever published in Sri Lanka by a local author. His third book, Serendipity, which you just saw, was shortlisted for the State Literary Prize. Ashok is a guest lecturer at the Sri Lanka Institute of Architecture and the host of his own TV show, The Ashok Ferry Show. Can we catch it on YouTube? Can we catch it on YouTube?
Little bits.
Little bit.
All the kind of crazy little bits.
Okay. The bloopers and the outtakes.
Exactly.
Oh, very good. Okay. It's an arts program on national television. In his spare time, he is a personal trainer to the rich and infamous. And that's what your program notes would have told you anyway. What it doesn't tell you is that as perfect as he sounds and as wonderfully accomplished in all sorts of directions, and he has 2 kids to boot and so on, he also has cholesterol.
Absolutely. Very high cholesterol.
I felt so much better, and he still eats like a, I won't say it.
Horse.
Horse, okay. Farah Ghuznavi. We're so glad to have Farah with us today. I've had a chance to interact with her at a couple of other locations prior to this, and just reading through her work and being very impressed. Farah is a writer, newspaper columnist, and development professional whose work has been published in the UK, US, Canada, Singapore, Nepal, India, and her native Bangladesh. I think we've covered the geopolitical part of our conversation.
Good, now we can get on to the rest of it.
Her flash fiction piece, Judgment Day, was highly commented on, highly commended in the 2010 Commonwealth Short Story Competition, and her short story, Getting There, placed second in the Oxford GEF competition held at Oxford University. She is also a columnist at the Star magazine, the most widely read English language publication in Bangladesh, also read by someone in the High Commission in Delhi, and therefore her visa is extremely facilitated, let's say.
That might have been too much information. Please disregard it.
Okay. Farah is currently working on her short story collection and recently edited and contributed to. And this is where I first found Farah, because this is a publisher very dear to me, Zuban, and this is an anthology, Lifelines, which has a short story by her, and I don't know, maybe more importantly still, edited by her, the whole collection. It's a collection of new writing from Bangladesh.
15 stories.
15 stories. So without further ado, we're done with the introductions. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. So just the kind of quarrel I had with the geopolitical thing is maybe a little bit to do with, of course we all bring our own experiences into these conversations, and it was only when I heard another writer, a Dominican writer in the United States, say that he doesn't have a problem being identified as a, his geopolitical location as a Dominican American writer, as long as it's not the only thing he gets to be, that he is also a writer and many other things too. And so I've always kind of had this feeling of being confined myself in the sense that out in the world, people will look at me and say, you're an Indian writer. And then in India, we have a debate about what an Indian writer is and who are we writing for and so on. And after a while, the debate gets a little stale, and that need to breathe and move out of our borders and to cross makes me want to look beyond those boundaries and those borders, and what else are we doing in our fiction? Now, hopefully, if we talk about a little bit beyond.
Yeah, actually, it's even worse for being a Sri Lankan writer, because nobody knows anything about Sri Lankan writers, except for now we have Shahan Karunatilaka. But till a few years ago, we were also Indian writers or South Asian writers. So it's very constricting. And it's quite sad that the world feels that they need to kind of label us in this way.
But yet, I know that when you sit down to write, you don't feel unknown. When you said no one knows Sri Lankan writers, I don't have that sense in your writing. I read through this collection of yours, Love in the Tsunami, and was quite amazed at the hopping around that it does.
Yeah, but that's
England, Somalia.
Yeah, I think if you're a writer, you really need to write for yourself. So you can't imagine other people know you or not know you. But I get the feeling that nobody really knows what Sri Lanka is or what a Sri Lankan writer is about. It's just a feeling I have. But you have to totally disregard that when you write, and you just write to please yourself, really.
No, I think Ashok is absolutely right in that respect. I think for most of us, when we sit down to write something, we write something because there is a story or an idea in our heads that's driving us to put it down on paper. It's really not about, you hope that someone will read it at some point, but that's really not why you're doing it. You're doing it basically to silence the voices in your head, which might land you in different places if you don't manage to do it in time. And I think when you do that, you're not thinking about geopolitical boundaries or anything else. The only thing I would say that I do consciously think of as a Bangladeshi writer, because not that many of us have been internationally recognized yet, hopefully, is I have a very serious concern about authenticity. Because I think, and that I think is from the whole region, particularly in the Western world, there is a perception of writing from this part of the world being very exotic somehow. We have to throw in the dancing girls and the elephants on the street in order to make it interesting, and sometimes to reinforce stereotypes as well, because that's really what a certain kind of audience wants. And I think one of the things that I would like to do, and I think Ashok also, is to move beyond those stereotypes and tell the stories of real people, very different real people in very different circumstances, but real people nevertheless.
Interesting you brought out that thing about exoticism, because I was just talking to Mridula earlier about the new book covers for the sort of the international versions of my stories. Kolpiti People is about, it's about people in a very smart area of Colombo. So there's nothing, what's the word, exotic or village-like about them. And yet, the New Yorker who designed the cover made it very exotic with lovely Sri Lankan damsels selling vegetables in the village fair. So I emailed and I said, look, this isn't quite right, but the message didn't get across. And then the conclusion I came to was, who am I? I'm merely the writer. It is the people out there who see you in this way. And that's how it is.
If I can just have the book for a second. We had a launch of Lifelines in London at the South Asian Lit Fest. And I had joined by Skype, and unfortunately technology was being more than usually unfriendly. So everything I could see basically looked like mud, and I really couldn't hear anything. There was someone sitting at the other end typing on Facebook to tell me what the questions were. And one of the things that came up was this issue of the cover. And I heard them talking about covers, and they said, well, when apparently when South Asian women in particular write, they always, the publishers, particularly in the US, always like to have a woman in a sari on the cover. According to Salil Tripathi, who was my And And then it turned out that this writer of, I think, also Sri Lankan origin, Marianne Mohanraj, had actually done a piece of very angry research about this. And I recommend that you Google her and find that, because it was quite amazing. So I, in this very muddled discussion, panicked because I thought they were referring to our cover for Lifelines as being that kind of exotic. And I had been very pleased when I found it, because it's a young Bangladeshi artist. And I don't think you can see it from here, but basically she's not wearing a sari. And she has some quite interesting body art, tattoos on it. So I was frantically trying to signal from Bangladesh on Skype to say, no, this was not a publisher decision. Sorry, can you see it? Yeah. So I got very worried, and then luckily John Slack, who was the person on Facebook, said, no, Farah, you must calm down. They're actually saying your cover is quite nice. So you see, we go through a lot of agony over these covers, even when we try our best.
You're very lucky, because I remember Marianne showing me her proposed cover, and it was a wet sari. It wasn't just a sari.
It was just the woman was not in the sari.
She was wearing a sari, and it was wet. So,
wet. I'm sorry, I thought you said it was a red sari. As Farah was.
Apparently, the sign of success is in the US for the second edition. The author does get to have some say, but they have to wait for that successful second edition.
So, if you feel this, I can't remember the exact word, you said this sense of needing to get it right, authentic, yes. Is it possible to be nuanced and authentic?
I think the whole point of being authentic is that it has to be nuanced. I mean, the exotic stereotypes are in very broad brushstrokes. It's the miserable woman or the very violent man or whatever it is. You can write stories about women in unhappy domestic situations, or about men who have issues with violence or anger or any number of other things. But, the more nuanced you make it, the more, I presume, it will be believable and less of a, sort of cartoon cutout version.
In your story, The Mosquito Net Confessions, I do remember coming across the minor character Devi, and I think you're right. This is a case of a city protagonist, an urban protagonist, going into the countryside, and as in a lot of the stories that you've written that I've read, there are these women who are confronted with varying degrees of violence, borders, let's say, that they are trying to cross, confinements in which their life is held. So this more of a minor character in the story then throws into relief questions of violence, but also of fortitude and courage, because she's a fighter and she's fighting back. And our protagonist, who the story is about, is looking at her and telling us about this rather unexpected glimpse in literature, not necessarily in life, because there's courage everywhere in the world, but in literature.
Well, I'll be honest here and say that that particular character is based on somebody that I met. I worked for the Grameen Bank for 3.5 years. My background is in development, and a lot of those experiences in some form feed into my writing. But Debi in particular is very closely based on a real character whom I met, and that story is more or less true. That aspect of the short story, not the whole one.
When we talked about borders, and in my head anyway, at least one of the things reading your writing, Ashok, was, I said earlier, I feel quite confined at times, and even in my writing I'm struggling for a kind of fluidity that I saw in your writing. You have stories in which Sri Lankans are Sri Lankan without seemingly needing to notice it. They're, as it turns out, a few sentences into the story, somewhere else in the world, say in England, and they're in conversation with someone maybe from Colombia, and they're commenting on the Colombianness of the Colombian and not on their Sri Lankanness, and nor is anybody else in the story commenting on Sri Lankanness. So this, I thought, was sort of an extreme fluidity and very wonderful to see the world in Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka in the world.
I think it's easy when you are Sri Lankan, because it's an island which has been had countless invasions, both friendly and otherwise, over its 3,000 years. So there are lots of us who have little strains from other places, and I think it's probably one nation where, if it goes abroad, if Sri Lankans go abroad, they don't necessarily congregate together. and they will take over the kind of the aura, the persona of the host country, in a way that Indians perhaps don't. Indians are very proud of their own nationality, their own culture.
Sometimes self-defensively.
Yes,
but anyway.
yes. And with Sri Lankans, we go to absolutely the other extreme. So in a way, it's very easy for a Sri Lankan character to talk to a Colombian and discuss that, because that's how we are.
So you are one of many. I mean, this is an engagement that you see, not only you in your writing, but this is a cultural engagement.
I think it's a cultural thing. Yeah.
Do you think there's anything particular about being a Bangladeshi writer or about the Bangladeshi culture that you see in contrast with what you've seen maybe in India, maybe elsewhere in the world? What is uniquely? Or perhaps there is no such thing. Maybe all writing is all writing, wherever,
I think
across
people
whatever
are people.
boundaries.
You know, there are aspects of culture or experience that will inform behavior, for example. But I think in good writing, at least I feel that, you know, it shouldn't really matter where my character is from. Not only my own character, but the story that I'm reading, because do I relate to it at a human level? And that's not to get away from what you're saying. I think Ashok, example of Sri Lanka is very particular. I think Bangladeshis, when we are abroad, are amazingly nice to each other. People are very excited to see you. They give you free cab rides, you know. They give you free sweets at the, you know, the quote-unquote Indian restaurant in London. But I think that writing in that sense, I don't think can afford to be too self-conscious.
See, I think when Indians are abroad, we really avoid each other. We look away. And when I was a teenager and living in the United States in Los Angeles, I had friends who were not Indian, and we had this thing called Indian Alert, which is when there's another Indian on the street approaching you. Because, I mean, the thing was, I was looking to make the eye contact. I've never had any free cab rides. It's usually a certain kind of embarrassment. So I think people are actually not, there's been a lot of emphasis on how same we are, how similar we are, how we are human, which is this wonderful value that we do see in writing, because to the extent that literature, you know, creates this empathy, which can only be based on finding ourselves in others. We've sometimes erred on the side of not looking at the particularities. So something in your writing that I saw relevant to our topic is how often your characters do leave Bangladesh and then come back to Bangladesh. And you had one particular story in which there was these gradations of what I thought of as returning, or, you know, the crossing back home. And so you had two characters in the Mosquito Net Confessions, one of whom feels quite outside of her society at the beginning of the story, but then later on in the story encounters someone who is truly and truly outside.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say that we can discuss the issue of geographical boundaries, of course. The lead character in Mosquito Net Confessions, which I will read an excerpt from later, is very taken up with the fact that she's been overseas and she doesn't quite feel at home back in Bangladesh. And then because she's working for this development organization, has to go on a field trip and prove herself, so she's in a very heightened state of anxiety. And I think this is where you kind of see, I would say not borders so much as a question of boundaries, and not crossing so much as incursions in a way. So what the boundary that she's crossing in a way is the rural-urban divide, and a cultural divide that actually exists within her own country. And speaking of these kind of boundaries, I think you're right that it does come up quite a lot in my writing, because I was looking at another set of stories, and this issue of power dynamics. You know, when we're talking about borders and boundaries, the most basic one is this issue of bodily integrity. And so I had one story which is about a child domestic worker who experiences violence from her employer. And there's this very particular set of power dynamics that I think most of us are familiar with, though hopefully not in the extreme form. And then there's another story where it's the driver of the household who is harassing the young girl, the employer's daughter. But the power dynamics are in his favor, which is interesting because the class dynamics theoretically shouldn't be, but he's a trusted member of that family. So there again, you're looking, you know, the boundaries are not necessarily what you expect them to be. And I think also this issue of time, because I wrote this very short science fiction story that Mridula was referring to earlier called Judgment Day, which is set in the future and is looking at how the institution of marriage might change and what might remain familiar to us. And then finally the story in Lifelines called Getting There, which is really about traveling between one's own sort of present and past, and revisiting things and recognizing that things are maybe not the way that you thought they were all your life. So there are very many boundaries in all of our lives, and you know, it's interesting to see how we cross them and how we come back, and how those crossings affect us in the process of engaging in them.
A little jump from here. I'm so glad you spoke about gender and class, which was really, I thought, quite a lot of what forms your subject, I mean, at the thematic level in your stories. I wonder how much the two of you writing in English, but writing characters who are not English-speaking characters. Dia in Mosquito Net's Confessions is English-speaking, but you render Debi and other people who are not speaking in English, you render them in English. I wasn't so certain with you because many of your characters are moving in an English-speaking world, whether they're in Somalia and they're, you know, the embassy child or the teacher from Sri Lanka teaching in some place in Africa. Perhaps many of them are English-speaking, but certainly some of your characters are some of the time speaking in Sri Lankan and in Sinhalese,
Yeah.
and you're rendering them in English. How much of are you aware? I mean, I
Yes,
think of that as a boundary in my writing.
Actually, interestingly, my little daughter has just started reading Serendipity, and she brought this up, that there is a tuk-tuk driver in it, a three-wheeler, you call it here, or an auto rickshaw, and he speaks English. Well, of course, in real life, he would speak broken English, or he'd speak Sinhala with English words in it. And she was asking me, why is he speaking perfect English? It's a big problem. I mean, if you present them speaking kind of broken English, it's kind of patronizing. And it seems to send out a message that that guy, his thoughts are somewhat defective. So you have to give him the proper language, I feel, anyway. What do you think on this, Farah?
I think I agree with you. I think the other thing is it interrupts the flow of the story. Unless you actively want to say that your characters are communicating in English. I've worked as a translator quite extensively, and so when I'm writing this dialogue for a Bangla-speaking character, what I'm really thinking about is the flow of the language, are the stylistic nuances. Is this the way that character would formulate the sentence? And in fact, in the excerpt from Mosquito Net Confessions, I'm going to ask for a little indulgence from all of you because a couple of sentences are rendered in Bengali, but they will be translated. And there I've used the very idiomatic, the regional dialect. So I think the challenge in a way is if you want to make the story believable, you want to convey how that tuk-tuk driver would speak in terms of his vocabulary rather than broken English.
Absolutely. It's through the vocabulary or the phrasing or his jokes or whatever. But the language remains bog standard English.
It remains one that is as articulate or as true to the level of how articulate your character would be in his own head. Yes, I think we owe our characters that, aside from all the political considerations. I know when I'm writing, I'm in a relationship with the character and faithful to the character.
Yeah, it's this question of patronization, which I find really difficult because, I mean, a writer has to work on two levels. It's not only the word on the page, but it's the thought that you're getting into the head of your reader. And if the thought differs and there is a disconnect, your reader wonders, now, where exactly is the writer on this? I mean, he can see the word, but where is the thought? And that's why it's a very tricky question, this language question.
I think the other thing for me is also that, we have certain preconceptions and attitudes, particularly I think in this part of the world, and here I will generalize, about people who are from different classes. And one of the things that I experienced through my development work, and which is reflected in that character that you were talking about of Debi's, is that so much of the time intelligence and approach is not correlated with education as highly as we like to believe. You find people, I mean, in the Grameen Bank system, they put together groups of 5 women and 8 to what is called a center, so 40 women. And in my years kind of traveling and meeting these women, you would always find some who were natural leaders. You would find some who were natural innovators or entrepreneurs. And I think that we need to, if coming back to this concern about authenticity, that is what I saw, that is what I believe. So, you know, just to say that a character is poor, let's say, is a tuk-tuk driver, or is, you know, is a borrower of a bank like this, it's a tremendous injustice to dumb down the character in order to fulfill some preconception of what your reader might think that they're like. If that's what your reader does think, which I question, perhaps it's your job to change their mind.
And this is somewhat a technical question, I think, the question of language, and we solve it in various ways, whether with, because at the same time we're trying to be true to the fact that they exist in another language, so that too must be rendered somewhere, whether it's a glossary or italicization, or more recently, none of the above, but maybe we render it syntactically. Just jumping from there to like, something that I ended up thinking it has to be a technique of some kind with you, Ashok, is you do this thing in so many of your stories which borders on sort of gruesome humor. And last night I started
Don't believe her, don't believe her.
No. I think it's wonderful.
It's true.
It's certainly not something I do in mine, so I notice it, right? And I was thinking about this question of crossing and borders, and how do we actually do the crossing? And I thought, gosh, I mean, at least my experience in your writing is you do it with these kind of flip jokes. You lighten the moment so that a door opens in that momentary lightening of the story. So I'm sorry I'm not coming up with great examples right off the top of my head. Last night I was starting to tell you a story about, totally nothing to do with writing, but about how people who fall from planes actually kind of get flayed as they fall, lose their skin because of the great friction of the fall and so on in the air. And hesitated thinking, oh, this is too gruesome to share at dinner. And then I thought, no, it's not, it's Ashok. I can share this story. So you have the equivalent stuff is what I'm saying.
It's true. I have one story where a dog gets curried. But
yes,
I mean,
the dog, oh my God, and his little yellow tuft of hair sticking out of the soil.
But when you think about it, gruesomeness is a great leveler, disaster is a great leveler, you know? I mean, you immediately, you have crossed that boundary straight away. If there is a disaster, everybody reacts in the same way to a gruesome situation or a disaster. I don't know, that's my sort of gut way of dealing with disaster. I think in Sri Lanka we have a very, very good proven track record of disaster, and us Sri Lankans, we are well equipped to deal with it, and humor is one of them, I think.
I read that particular story where the dog is curried in Love in the Tsunami, and this is also a class story because we have a young man who's been working in a house, and you give him a lot of parallel space in this story because we enter his head, he's griping while he does the things he's supposed to do for the two madams who keep, or there's a madam and a sir and then another madam. And they're funny and they're great and they have their own life and story that you tell also. It's not that the two lives exist as a commentary on one another till this final horrible moment where one of them cooks the other one's dog.
Yeah, actually it's a hugely complex story because there are bits in it which no one who is not Sri Lankan would even understand. It's to do with the fact that in the 1960s, a very misguided prime minister did away with English. So the entire story is actually about this subject, where because English was taken away and Sinhala was made the national language, at the stroke of a pen, you destroyed an entire sort of civilization. You have people then who have had to learn English from scratch, like the guy who works for the two madams, and then you have the one madam who is to the manor born but who's gone off to England and come back to find that life is quite poor for her, and she has to sort of struggle to make ends meet. And you have the other one who's made pots of money abroad but who doesn't quite have the class of her friend. So it's a very tricky one where the story moves between all these characters who have various various powers of control over their language. So it is really about language, that story.
If we can do a couple readings, because I know the questions are building in the audience. So, but we'll do the readings first and then take some questions from the audience. Do you want to go first? So Farah, you're going to read to us from the Mosquito Net Confessions, an excerpt from the story?
Yes, the story is essentially, as I said, about this young woman who has a job with a development organization, a new job, and she's just heading out. And she's heading up a team which consists of 3 people from the Ivory Coast and a translator who is also Bangladeshi, but as Ashok just gave you an example in his previous story, the language issue here is complicated. It was time. Dia took a deep breath, settling the butterflies in her stomach that were threatening to take flight en masse. Her team members were packed in like sardines, baggage sandwiched haphazardly into every available crevice for the long journey south. 5 women traveling together, and she was in charge. Barely a month into her new Grameen Bank job, Dia was going on a field trip with 3 Francophone Africans who spoke no English, and Shahana, a Bangladeshi American who didn't speak Bangla. A barrage of questions came from Sylvie, Verite, and Felice, newly arrived from the Ivory Coast. How many villages will we visit? Are we staying with the villagers? What do people like to eat in Bangladesh? How does it feel to work with a genius like Professor Yunus? He seems so nice. Is he really that nice? The Ivorians were a cheerful lot, dressed in colorfully patterned, full-length robes that flowed loosely around their generous curves. By contrast, their Bangladeshi American translator was petite and slim, with a mass of dark brown curls and cat-like green eyes. Shahana intervened from time to time to clarify some of the French flying around the interior of the microbus, somehow remaining a little aloof nevertheless. They arrived at the village late at night, the lanterns hanging overhead in small wooden shops revealed proprietors squatting amidst piles of glucose biscuits in shocking pink wrappers, glass jars crammed with sticky sweets, and round black wire cages cradling fresh eggs. By then, the travelers were tired, hungry, and a little grouchy. Dia struggled to maintain her role as local expert and team cheerleader, grateful for the lack of a common language between the 5 of them. It made any grumbling blessedly incomprehensible. The office building was deserted, staff members away at a training course. The only remaining inhabitant, the peon, obligingly headed out into the darkness to forage for whatever food was available so late. He returned proudly bearing tiny bananas, a dozen eggs, milk bread, and that staple of travelers in out-of-the-way places, a liter bottle of Coca-Cola. Realizing that this was not the time to share with her team members her failure to pass a single domestic science exam in 3 years at Holy Cross School, Dia struggled valiantly with a single-ring electric stove and a frying pan that had seen better days to produce something resembling an omelette. She couldn't have done it without Shahana's help. The other woman held the electrical cord, jiggling the plug with some dexterity to keep the irregular flow of power going. Later, they would admit how their hearts sank each time the red glow of the stove dimmed. Another frantic round of movement by Shahana gradually restored it to life. After wolfing down the food, they retired for the night. Dia and Shahana were taken to a second-floor office room. A number of desks had been hastily pushed against the wall to make room for a mattress on the floor. A skewed mosquito net hung drunkenly over the makeshift bed, its 4 corners tied to whatever could be found. A window grill, a nail protruding from the wall, a light fixture. A few faint smears of dust remained on the floor, bearing mute testimony to the cleaner's neglect. But those details were overlooked that first night, both women falling instantly asleep in their new surroundings. The pair awoke earlier than planned the next morning. At 6:30 a.m., 3 people knocked on that door, happily announcing to a bleary-eyed Dia that they had come to see the foreigners. Her sensibilities already outraged at the idea of the visitors being treated like animals in a zoo. Dia wasn't impressed by the hour at which the viewing commenced either. আপনাদের কি আর কিছু করার নাই মানুষকে এভাবে বিরক্ত করা ছাড়া? Don't you have anything better to do than disturb people this early in the morning, she snarled. Their uninvited guests, the first local inhabitants to have heard the exciting news of the team's arrival, reciprocated her lack of warmth. In an equally hostile tone, one responded, আপনার সমস্যাটা কি? আমরা তো তাগরে দেখতে আসছি, আপনারে তো দেখতে আসি নাই. What's your problem? We've come to see them. It's not as if we've come to see you. But you've managed to wake us up, haven't you, Thea grumbled. To no avail. Tuki, so what? The intruders clearly couldn't understand what the city folks were so annoyed about. Culture shock had already begun to set in.
And you're going to give us the whole story.
Sorry?
You're going to give us the whole story.
Yes, sort of an abridged version. And I'm going to cheat because normally I get to read all the funny bits. I have this very unjust reputation for being a funny man in Sri Lanka. So when I go abroad, I try and read sad stories. This is the story about the death of somebody. It's called Pack Up the Moon, and it's from my collection in Kolpiti People. The old man died as he had lived, with no trouble to anyone, slipping away quietly on a Sunday afternoon. I just walked back home to my yellow rice and chicken curry when they called, and I could tell they were annoyed that I'd left them at the crucial moment. It's happened. What are we going to do? I'll be there in a second, I said, but I took my time. You know me, my yellow rice and I are parted with difficulty. For me, the old man had died a long time back, at least a month before. I'd watched him as he made his sure-footed way down, circle below circle, as his body and then his mind left him, and the slow, sweet smell of corruption set in. By the time his children arrived from England, his mind was all but gone, and when they walked in through the door, a big, foolish grin lit up his face, like a strong light in an empty room. How could I tell them that the doctors were killing him with their many kindnesses and their strong pills? I'd been through many crises with him in the past 10 years, fought in bleak hospital rooms with no one else around, and he'd survived them all, because he was a tough old Candian from the mountains. But he was also of a generation that believed implicitly in the power of Western medicine and relished that little brass tray of pills that was offered up to him daily. Once, when he was really down, he'd said to me in the depths of his despair, "It's all been such a mess, hasn't it?" He was crying, and I had to hold his head in my arms. Of course not, I had lied. And who was I in all this, you might ask? Me? I was just a friend from 2 streets away who fed him and washed him and carried him to the bathroom like a baby and tried to make him go by turning on all the taps. I remember very well the last time he communicated with me. I just finished giving him his lunch, and his Candian relations walked in, big, square-shaped people in their old-fashioned jeeps and their dusty limousines. I got up to go, because there is only so much a good neighbor can take. The old man gave me a look of panic, but I was unrelenting, and as I left him, his face softened, and he gave my hand a slight squeeze. For me, that was his last goodbye. After that, there was only a rusting hull settling slowly to the bottom of a murky sea. I won't bore you with the sordid details of death, the shit on the bed sheets, the wicked catheters, the bed sores like wounded strawberries, and always and everywhere that slow, sweet smell of death, like tea with too much milk in it. Have you ever been present at a Sri Lankan death? No? Well, I can tell you that the body is barely cold when the fun begins. People come from far and wide. Your neighbors, who have hitherto never been allowed past your front door, finally get a chance to inspect that damp patch on your back bedroom ceiling, which you never had time to do anything about. And they will examine very thoroughly, because they know they will never get another chance. They will check the tins in your kitchen cupboards and the softness of your guest towels, and all the while they will weep copious tears while being fed and watered at your expense. The old man, in his wisdom, had decreed a cremation, unusual for a Catholic. I chose a coffin that was neither the cheapest nor the most expensive. By the time I got back, it was night, and the house was thick with neighbors. There was a pride of nuns huddled over the body. I tell you, there was more praying done there that night than in all the game parks of Kenya. I left them to it and walked home. The cremation was short and sharp, and there were not many people, just the basic hardcore in at the kill. The old man had outlived all his friends, and indeed his enemies. I'm proud of the fact that I did not cry, not even when they asked me to press the little green button to start the fire, thinking by mistake that I was head of the family. Did I grieve for him, you ask? Did I grieve? Well, let me tell you that I grieved all the time, every day till that final month. Most of all, I grieved as I ran round the park in the sodium yellow hours of early morning, and I grieved as I did my sit-ups on the wet grass while the sun rose lazily over the jacarandas. But in that last month, that grief turned to mechanical weariness when it took 2 hours to feed him a quarter cup of coffee and another 2 for a quarter glass of water. Life dripping away by the teaspoonful. The funeral festivities were endless. The 7th day dane, the 1-month almsgiving, the memorial mass, and always he was present, that slow, sweet smell. At every step, the guests ate their fill with much grief and gusto. It was after Mass, I think, that they decided to open the will, which the eldest boy produced. I was the only outsider there, having stayed behind to tidy up. The old man hadn't much to leave. A lifetime of fair success, followed by a series of bad investments towards the end. They all got pretty much what they expected and deserved. Listen to this, said the eldest, who was reading it out. To Ashok, my friend, I leave my kavitchya. I held my breath. The kavitchya was not his most valuable possession, but easily his most valued. It was an ebony couch, a severely elegant thing with Grecian lines on which the old man used to take his afternoon naps. There was silence in the room. But you wouldn't want it, would you, Ashok? It was a statement, not a question, so I didn't bother to answer. I put away the last plate. The old man was gone. It was time for me to go too. As you can imagine, I didn't bother to say goodbye. It must have been a good 3 months later that the doorbell rang, and when I opened the gate, the familiar blue van drove in. It was Chuti, the youngest and in many ways best of the bunch. I have your kavitchya, he said. It wasn't easy to extract, as you can imagine. Together, we unloaded it in the front yard. I won't take it in, if you don't mind. My back's playing up. In fact, I'd best be getting along. I wouldn't want them to think we were getting too friendly. The van drove off. There was a wind blowing in the yard, and it was getting dark. As I stood there, he was there with me, that slow, sweet smell. 3 seconds, 4 seconds, and he was gone. But the kavitchya remained, glowing and resplendent among the shabby palms. Thank you very much.
We have 5 minutes, so we'll move to some questions from the audience. Can we have the lights on, because we really can't see anybody out there? The inspiration behind your writing, okay, whatever you want to say about.
Well, actually, most of it is from real life. I'm sad to say, and I don't like to admit this, because writers are supposed to pluck these things out of thin air. But in my case, it's what I see around me. So be very careful what you tell me.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Not so much what I see around me, but a lot of the work that I've done and a lot of the people that I've met. And I've often thought that the stories that I've heard from them are very interesting, that they wouldn't necessarily have a chance to render that story to a wider audience. And sometimes I feel that the stories are worth it. And because I'm in the position to be able to do it, that's some of it. And some of it is completely random. As I said, the voices in my head.
Hello. This is a question to Ashok. Ashok, it's interesting that you spoke about a natural death. But coming from Sri Lanka, how have you handled all the deaths and killings around you? How has that impacted your writing?
I think if you were cynical, you would say that we were being cynical, because I think we just learned to turn the page and carry on. But it's a defense mechanism, and you can't really blame us for it. I personally have had 4 major bombs at various points of the road I live on. And, you know, after a while you think, well, what's one more bomb? If you go, you go, you know? Really, it gets to that stage. And I don't even think it's to do with the 28-year civil war. I think throughout Sri Lanka's history, we've had all these kinds of disasters, whatever. And it makes us very resilient, but in a strange way. It makes us quite cunning and devious, and also very cynical. But it's a protective mechanism. No, actually, beyond a certain point, you know, you think it's all up there. It's somebody pulling strings, and you just, you know, really, you just carry on. You just live for the day.
I'm certain I've heard it said somewhere that writing in a way is an act against death or whatever. So.
Absolutely, and I think Mridula said it, because I mean the only form of immortality there is, it's not statues out in the park, but it's the written word. So perhaps that is one way of
counteracting. It's certainly something that we all do eventually die. So we have 2 more minutes, one last question.
Yeah, one question here, please. Right here. Hi.
Horror, absolute horror, and what is more, it was a planned thing done by somebody who was incredibly wicked, and he did it for very, very devious reasons. So you know, and the fact is, very interesting you point this out, because the person who was responsible, do you know that his family has had an extremely tragic existence? Both the man who was behind it and his I just put it into a competition back home, but I used yet another name. So please tell your friend that I'm not going to reveal this in public.
Hello, sir.
Are we out of time? I just want to make sure before I...
Ma'am, one last question.
1 second. Okay, this is the last question. Yes, go ahead.
Usually the subject is border crossing. It's seen that there's an identity crisis and a sense of alienation which a person feels when he goes out of his country. Can you elaborate on that?
We didn't quite hear you. Could you repeat that? And is it for Farah, this question?
Both of you, actually.
Okay. If you could repeat the question, please.
It is seen that a person feels an identity crisis or a self-isolation when he goes to another country. Since this topic is on geopolitical border crossing, can you elaborate on that, or have you seen
identity
in your life
crisis,
an alienation?
Alienation, identity crisis when crossing borders.
I think for many people from Bangladesh at least, you know, the drivers that lead people to go overseas are often, you know, it's perceived as very attractive. Benjamin talked about this earlier in a session, you know, about the sort of everywhere else is the land of milk and honey. People go there, they think it's going to be an amazing life, new opportunities, whatever, clean streets. The clean streets might just about materialize, but a lot of the other things don't necessarily turn out the way that they want. So I think for a lot of immigrants, there is a kind of reality check, if you will. It's quite different to go as a student, for example, than it is to go as a migrant worker of a certain kind. And I think I'm just going to tell you a very small story where I was on a plane, and it was a plane full of migrant workers to the Middle East, and there were these 3 young men sitting in front of me, and 2 of them had obviously been out before, and they were telling the third one that when the cabin crew member comes, you must ask her for 2 beers. Okay, he spoke no English, so she came along and he said 2 beer. So she gave it, you know, once she understood, and he poured some of it. You know, they had all asked for 2 beers. The other 2 were drinking theirs, and he poured it. And he just spat it out, and he shouted in Bangla. He was like, "Oh my God, what was that? It was poison, it was poison." And she couldn't understand what he was saying, of course. So she was looking very freaked out. And I said, "I think you need to give him some juice, something sweet, very quickly." You know, so it's a very small microcosm of the way things don't necessarily turn out. And then you either choose to adapt and, you know, make of it what you will, or you look for others like you, and the, you know, the protection in numbers and so on. And you revert in a way to almost quite a hostile version of the culture that you came from. You know, for example, the Bangladeshis who live in Britain, in the East End, I've met a lot of the second generation who will tell me, "Oh, you know, in Bangladesh you can't do this, you can't do that." And in Bangladesh, actually, you can do all of these things because it's 50 years since their fathers left, but somehow the adults in their community, the seniors, are in a time warp, and so they're choosing to teach their children this, and that can be very isolating from the mainstream community. So I think, you know, it forces people into particularly second-generation migrants, into making a choice between whether they will be this or that. Whereas I think most people would agree that, you know, the healthier version is going to be some hybrid of where your parents came from and where you are living now.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. I think quite often the people who go away are frozen in time, and the home country has moved on. And a lot of my stories have this, where they come back and they're quite surprised that the home country has moved on, whereas they haven't, although they're living in the West. I have a friend who lives in San Francisco. She's lived there for 40 years, and yet she's much more Sri Lankan than I am. And I've lived in Sri Lanka for the last 30 years. But because she's away, she somehow feels she's got to fly the flag. And so she's very, very arch-conservative, etc. So it's what Farah says.
We'll call it a day there. The two of you will be available to sign books outside and do buy the book, and we can have more of this conversation, but the next session will be starting in a minute, I think, or something.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to Ashok Ferry and Farah Ghuznavi.